Okay, welcome everyone. Everyone is rolling in. You might hear a dog in the background. That is my neighbor. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Brittany Higginbotham with the Institute for Public Relations. We are so excited to host this conversation, a very important and timely conversation for all of you. I have a few housekeeping notes before I transition to our speaker intros and until we get this started. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback within 48 hours. If you have any tech difficulties, questions, just let myself or any IPR staff member know. And please feel free to share any comments, questions in the chat or Q&A. We'll definitely address those questions with our speakers. And yes, if you need anything, just let us know. We're all kind of dropping in where we're calling in from. I'm calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. Our panelists love to see the, international audience that we see pretty frequently in our webinars. So with that, let me transition into a little bit about our speakers. We have Anitra Henry, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Institute for Public Relations. She's authored this research, and we're so grateful to have her sharing some of the insights with us today. We also have Emily Graham, Chief Equity and Impact Officer and SVP of DEI Communications at Omnicom. And then last but not least, we have Mac Worsham, and he's the Purpose and DEI Strategic Positioning and Talent Engagement Leader for Deloitte. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Anitra to get us started.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Brittany, for that great introduction. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Mac, and thank you all for being here to discuss Collaborators for Change research on the relationship between communications and diversity executives. I would first like to start by thanking our report sponsor, Emily K. Graham, who is here with us today of Omnicom Group. And I would also like to thank our anonymous sponsor. They know who they are, so thank you very much. And Emily, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about why you decided to sponsor this report and how this conversation came about when you were the co-chair of IPR's Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Thank you, Anitra, and welcome everyone. I am excited to be here, and I want to thank the Institute of Public Relations for taking the time to invite Mac and I to have a very important conversation about the study. Why did Omnicom decide that this was important to invest in? Because now more than ever, the affirmation and commitment and declaration that diversity, equity, inclusion is important has to be vocal, and it has to be action oriented. And I did not want to miss an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment. As an organization, we have had a chief diversity and inclusion role for 15 years. I am the second to sit in this seat. So our commitment is out loud, it is in front, and we believe that in a time where diversity and inclusion is under critique, attack, and question, that we wanted to leave no doubt that we believe as a Fortune 200 company that it is important, that it is essential, that it is good for our business, it is good for our people. And IPR has, since 2020, invested as an organization to make its newest center of excellence be focused on diversity, equity, inclusion. And I was really honored to be a co-chair and serve for a few years. And that community of communicators and academics who are invested in diversity, we had these ear to the ground conversations. And what we realized is at the time that diversity, equity, inclusion is becoming increasingly challenged and complicated to enact strategically across an organization, the partnership between a chief communications officer and a chief diversity inclusion officer is mission critical to success. And so we got to talking and we got to sharing anecdotes and real stories, and we figured, why don't we give space to interview these really important professionals and understand their roles, their contributions, their needs, and how the relationship can work for the better. So that's how it came to be. I selfishly have a lot of affinity and admiration for Mac Worsham. I've known him from very early in my career to now, and I've always admired him as a chief communicator in his role at Deloitte. And so I'm really especially excited that I get to be here today to talk about the relationship between these two important positions. That was long, Anitra. Sorry. You get me going. I'm
No,
just going to go. But
it
I
was
just wanted
perfect.
to answer all parts of the question.
That was perfect, Emily. Thank you so much. And thank you and Mac both, as well as so many of you out there, for your commitment, your out loud stand-up commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And that was a great segue into how it came about. So from that conversation that was held in the Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, we got to work. And we put together a dream team, which I'll introduce to you all later in this presentation. And they began to work on the study instrument. And so there were two pieces to the study instrument. First, there was a survey, a pre-qualifying survey that collected things like demographic data, those kinds of things. And then we also worked on questions with the intention of conducting focus groups with chief communications officers in their own few focus groups and chief diversity officers in their own few focus groups. And these people were ensemble, they are powerhouses in their own right. And so I just want to make a note here that when we say chief diversity officer, or we say chief communications officer, it doesn't mean that it was specifically that title. It refers to the person within their organization that performed the function of either the chief diversity officer or the chief communications officer, because we did speak to people across various sectors. So they represented agencies, they represented corporations, they represented nonprofit organizations of all sizes. The most important thing to take away from that is all of them had executives located in the United States. So there were some organizations that only had offices or an office in the United States, but there were also many organizations that were multinational organizations that participated in the study as well. We were also intentional about recruiting some overlapping organizations, meaning that we interviewed both the chief communications officer and the chief diversity officer from 5 organizations so that we could analyze and see what their experiences were like and what they had to say and how much that overlapped as well. After doing this, we got to work and began ensembling the focus groups and began speaking to people and collecting the data. But during this time, which was from March to August of 2023, some interesting external factors began to happen in our world. If you go back to that time in your memory bank, you'll recall that the Supreme Court handed down 2 decisions over last summer. One aimed at the LGBTQI community, as well as affirmative action. And we also saw legislation greatly restricting diversity, equity, inclusion, if not banning the teaching of it in a couple of states that came out last summer as well, Texas and Florida. So with that, it began to be a little bit more difficult, particularly for chief diversity officers to want to participate in the focus groups. So we shifted a little bit and began to offer interviews, individual interviews to those people who felt important, that they had something important to say, but needed an extra layer of anonymity to be able to feel safe in participating in the study. Here is a breakdown of our demographics of those who did participate in the study. And as you see here, in terms of gender, our chief communications officers were evenly split, 10 male, 10 female. And these are the breakdowns of how they identify. 4 identified as African American or Black, 2 identify as Hispanic, 4 identify as Middle Eastern, and 8 identify as White or Caucasian. For our CDOs, our Chief Diversity Officers, we had 6 male and 14 female that participated in the study. 14 identified as African American or Black, 2 identify as Asian, 2 identify as Hispanic, 4 identify as Middle Eastern, and 2 identify as White or Caucasian. Now, earlier I mentioned to you all that there was a dream team that came together to support this study and help draft the study instrument and also help recruit both chief communications officers as well as chief diversity officers to participate in the study. And I would like to take this moment to just thank them and call them out individually. Carmela Glover of Page Society and Diversity Action Alliance, Mike Kukowski of Orange Fiery, Jean LaCour, Diana Littman of MSL USA, Peter Lutt of Citizens Financial Group, Ariel Patrick of Ariel Investments, Tridi Pourbarami of Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and Jerry Shop of Experian. Many of these people are IPR trustees, so we thank them for their additional support and service. So now, Emily, we want to talk a little bit about some key takeaways. There were 5 that really stood out to me as I went through and wrote this report and sat through these interviews. And there are many more in the study. I think there's a total of 13, but I would love to get your take on many of these. And the first one that really stood out to me was learning more about the origin of the Chief Diversity Officer role. And as someone who has inhabited that role, what would you like to add, or what would you say stood out to you as you've gone through this process and achieved those heights? And what stood out to you from what your colleagues that inhabit this role in the study had to say about the origin? And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anitra. This finding being among the top 5 is really important because a lot of what I see in terms of conflict around the role of diversity, equity, inclusion is many people's misunderstanding of where it came from. There are those who believe that the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer role is a new role as a response to the racial tensions and the turmoil following George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020, and that is not accurate. Now, has there been a proliferation of Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officers since that time? Sure. I think our study revealed that LinkedIn cited a 168.9% surge in Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer hires between 2019 and 2021. And then we saw a negative growth between 2021 and 2022. And though we don't have the figures for right now, I would imagine that we're starting to see anecdotally some shifts decline. But the reason that this is such an important clarification point is because the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion stems all, in America at least, stems all the way back to the mid 60s. And that's when societally, the civil rights movement and a lot of legal changes began to happen that impacted the corporate world related to equal rights for employees, women and people of color, protected classes. And so with the introduction of equal employment laws and with the introduction of affirmative action, there became a more explicit need to have a designated party looking after what was going on with the implementation of those laws and those new policies that the country was newly creating. And that's another thing that people need to realize. These 1960, 1970 wasn't that long ago. And we were just in the tides of a major civil rights shift for people to have rights, to fully exist and identify in this country as themselves, right? And so as you start to look at corporate shifts from 1960 to 1970, then full affirmative actions in 1980, 1990 is when you start seeing a sprinkle of what they were calling chief diversity officers. And usually it was a legal officer, a person who was an attorney that was appointed into that role, or you started to see more human resources individuals appointed into that role. Move into the 2000s, and you have about 25% of the Fortune 100 or 200 have an actual C-level diversity role, and that person didn't report into the CEO. And then in nature, what happened in 2020 was most companies looked around and realized that there was a deficit in who was at the wheel really driving a true integrated diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. And for some, they hadn't been doing any work. And for those who had been doing work, they felt like their work was inadequate. So what there could be considered as an overcourse correction, right? Appointments of chief diversity and inclusion officers, promotions of people who had been in roles supporting in a chief diversity inclusion role, or as the study so kindly said, as somebody said, basically, I've been doing this role and I've been doing this work before I had the title. I have been representing and building our diversity program and platform for many years. However, it was in 2020 when the tragedy of George Floyd occurred and Breonna Taylor and so many others. I sat down and we talked about our level of commitment. And we decided we needed to make this an all agency, all hands on deck emergency, as SOS and I was asked to lead our efforts. So 2020 is when you saw several CDIOs have the official title, the official responsibility, role, and scope of leading diversity strategy across the entire enterprise of the company and be tasked with creating measurements and goals and a map for how that would be sorted. But it wasn't 2020 when this role was established. It was established far before that. Now we've just seen an uptick in how many chief diversity inclusion officers there are, and where we are seeing the critique of diversity and inclusion. Undoubtedly, you now see the critique of the person who's leading that job.
Thank you, Emily, because that is all very valid. And thank you for sharing the history and the origin of that role, because it's very important to understand where you've been with the role, to understand where we're going, especially in this time where things are a little murky and people feel differently, even if it's, in some cases, it is true what they're experiencing. In some cases, it may not be true. It's just what they see, because we also have the advent of social media and misinformation and disinformation around every topic, right? So let's talk a little bit about DEI prioritization. This was one for me that, given the study environment, as I was conducting these interviews with both CCOs and CDOs, that it was interesting to hear what each had to say about where the DEI fell in their organization's priorities. I loved the fact that most of them said it was top 5 for their organization. And that was across the board with chief diversity officers and chief communications officers. Now, there were some that didn't say that it identified as top 5, but all of the study participants identified it as a top 10 priority. Emily, what would you say about the prioritization of DEI in the workplace, and put it in the context of what you're experiencing now? And if you could get into your time machine and maybe head back a little bit to March to August of 2023. Yeah.
You know what I feel like it is like? I feel like it's being invited to someone's house and every room is having a different dinner party. And depending on which room you stop in and what they're talking about, what they're drinking, what they're eating, that is the conversation that's happening on diversity and inclusion right now. It is varied. It depends on the organization's alignment with diversity and inclusion prior to 2020. It depends on their status as an educational institution, as an institution that's working in professional services, whether they have clients, whether they're a government institution, because and I'm so curious to hear what Mac thinks about this, but now there is a true reputational risk associated with diversity, equity, inclusion in a way that creates some tension for some companies to be as forward in front maybe as they had been, or to really be thoughtful about their implementation and execution and communication around what diversity, equity, inclusion really means to them. I think while there's lots of debate about the merits of if DE&I is quote unquote working, I am very insistent in our teams and the strategy at Omnicom that we don't allow people to clump DE&I as a proper noun or an adjective or a verb. Diversity is something very important and essential. Inclusion is something very important and essential, as is equity. And all of those things are working together to advance us in a mission. The weaponry around the DEI or the DEIers, as we are now starting to see, to me is harmful rhetoric. I would like to see more companies not see this as an opportunity to deprioritize DEI, but rather evaluate their DEI priorities and determine where it needs to evolve. I'm not going to assume that we shouldn't relook at something that we looked at 3 or 4 years ago. Maturation in a strategy is essential for its survival, but that doesn't mean to kill it. And I feel like some companies are getting a little too shy about what they perceive to be a political issue. And I think this is a fundamental, systemic, human-centered strategy that is important for every business if it wants to survive and sustain, and every organization, every college, every university, if they really want to exist in the world as we know it to be.
Mac, I want to bring you into this conversation as someone who has led communications, been a CCO, and now has a part of your remit is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Talk to us about prioritization for you. And if you could put your lens on it as a CCO and then maybe give us a bridge.
Yeah, thank you both. It's so good to be here, Anitra, with you and Emily. I think Emily and I had a session like this probably over a year ago, and even the landscape has changed a lot since then. I will say I've been with the firm for Deloitte for a long time, and I more recently served as a leader of communications in the U.S. for about 8 years. And I'm in a leadership role now that I have found more rewarding than any role that I've had an opportunity to do at the firm. It's good that the firm is as large as it is. I've had many opportunities, but the role is strategic positioning and talent engagement within purpose in our purpose and DEI office. And let me take you back just a few years. I mean, Deloitte has been, I think, one of our first women's advancement-based initiatives, started back in the early 90s. And so I feel like we were at a very early stage developing DEI-based programs, national programs, and inclusive-based initiatives early on. And I saw most of corporations at that point, it was based on the add-ons of national programs and initiatives. And then as what I saw from Deloitte was, as we got into the 2010 timeframe, we started thinking about it a little differently and building equity into the processes that we actually have as organizations, at least more of the larger organizations were. What I'm seeing now, and by the way, we have a lot of chief DEI officers as clients of the firm, and this is a space that we do consulting in as well. I'm not necessarily seeing a departure from any commitments. Maybe some resetting, some reframing, but not backtracking. What I've seen is that companies are largely looking at how they can embed these equitable processes within the structure and operations of the organizations through talent processes, operational processes. I'm also seeing that organizations are understanding that it's certainly more than programs and initiatives. We've had more than 70 inclusion council across the U.S., which is phenomenal. But it's also about the role that each of our organizations plays externally and changing the landscape within communities and society around equitable opportunities, equitable and sustainable opportunities for all. So Deloitte created a purpose office in 2020. And the purpose office was really to look at the ways, as a firm as large as ours is, with 180,000 professionals as part of the U.S. firm, 60 billion globally, 450,000 people globally. How can we take that mass and amplify and scale the impact that we can have in our communities in areas that are important to us? The areas that are important to us: sustainability, equity, trust, and social impact. And if you think of the equity part of that, it was in 2023 where we brought our national DEI team our DEI Institute that does research around equity itself within communities, and put them as part of the purpose office. So we haven't necessarily reset everything, but what we're doing is trying to magnify the impact of our work so that it's inclusive. There are equitable issues in sustainability that are really, really important for our communities. So we didn't see it as a tease apart. We actually saw it as, let's bring this all together and actually increase the impact of our actions and our efforts. For me specifically, strategic positioning is about how we show up, how we strengthen the relationships with nonprofits in the communities that we're actually working in. And talent engagement is really around how do we continue to embed purpose and DEI in all of our firm's processes as solutions that are about equitable solutions for all, not about any one group. And I think that's where you're going to see the pivot for a lot of organizations is in some language, but I don't see that that's a departure from the equitable solutions that they were already striving to achieve in their organizations.
Thank you, Mac. Both of you have talked about and alluded to like the reporting structure. Emily, you talked about it when we were discussing the origin of the CDO role and how it evolved. And throughout this process and conducting this research, I found that there were a couple of different reporting structures that were dominant. And then through other research, I found that it may exist differently overseas than it does here in the United States. And so the reporting structure that seemed to be preferred and supported by both chief diversity officers and chief communications officers was that they strongly felt that the chief diversity officer should report directly to the CEO or the head of the organization. While that was pretty much the dominant reporting structure for those that participated in the study, it was not the case for many of them, for some of them. And they talked about why that would be the case, why it didn't feel like it was a good fit and how it might be a bit of a hindrance. In fact, one of the study respondents said that it felt more like a mismatch or misalignment as the CDO person, as the leader of CDO in that organization, being seated within human resources, because if there was someone behaving badly around diversity, equity, inclusion, it didn't do a lot to help build trust between the person that might be experiencing some of that bad behavior and having to be the person to resolve it. So I want to bring you both in to talk about reporting structures, what you might have experienced as a former CCO and chief diversity officer, what you've seen, what you've experienced, and what you feel personally works.
Okay, Mac, you want to take it first?
I'll let you go first, Emily.
Okay. I report to our CEO and chairman. And the role has always reported to our CEO chairman since its creation 15 years ago. We do not have a chief people officer at our holding company. We have 1,500 companies and some of them have chief people officers, some of them don't. Nonetheless, I still believe from what I've seen and what our clients see at Omnicom, because we have 5,000 clients, that CEO direct line is usually indicative of an organization's prioritization of where they see DE&I in their strategy. If it reports to a human resources officer or reports to a strategy officer, it's not that it's not important, but I find my ability to clear hurdles, to get directly to some solutions and issue resolve, to counsel in the time of challenge and issue to happen with ease because I directly report to the C-level officer. My access to the board of directors, and we are looking at diversity and inclusion as a key driver of our revenue success, of our cultural success. And when you look at it that way, the CEO wants that on his desk or her desk or their desk, one full stop. Now, I do believe that the relationship, partnership with chief people or human resources chief strategy, chief communications, which are other reporting structures I've seen, chief legal is so important. And being able to partner with and collaborate with those fellow members of the C-suite is not only important, but essential, I think, if the role is going to be successful, if the organization is set up in that way to have those different positions. I do draw concern, and this is where you see a lot of the consternation from chief diversity and inclusion officers. I draw a lot of concern in having someone have a C-level title and having them report to their peer.
Mhm.
If I am a chief, and that is truly what I am, then I should be reporting like the other chiefs report. And if they report to the CEO, then I should be reporting to the CEO. And we should have clarity on why and what, because that starts to talk about equity in and of itself. Are you paying this person the same? Are you giving them the same type of access to, performance if their peer is managing them? If are they truly peers? Is it truly a C-level role if they're reporting to someone who has a C-level role to them too? It's just weird.
Mhm.
It starts to get a little weird. And so if the organization has a clear understanding and lineage of it, it works for them. But I think that CDIOs need to be thoughtful and I don't want to go so far as to say adamant, but I would look very differently at a CDIO role if I were not reporting to the CEO at this point in my career and at this point in my work, because I see how effective and important it is. And I would also say that that CDIO needs to have executive sponsors and peer champions, executives champions in that fellow C-suite to help move DE&I as a business integrated strategy across. That's just my take.
Thank you, Emily. Mac, what would you add, if anything, to this conversation?
I echo everything that Emily has said. I don't have much more to add to that because in full agreement. We've had a chief DEI officer for as long as I can remember, and that DEI officer is reported up to the CEO. I report into the chief purpose and DEI officer. It is one role now. And he sits on the executive leadership team and reports into the CEO. That's consistently what I see of our client base as well. For us as a professional services firm, our people are our biggest asset. They're our product. They're our actually. So an inclusive and collaborative culture is incredibly important to how we grow as a firm, how we identify solutions and innovate and transform for the market. So it's like Emily said, it's like bread and butter to our actual business. It's fundamental to who we are as an organization and has been for a really long time.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both for sharing on that. Another key takeaway is optimism despite challenges. So again, if we go back into our time machine and think about the external factors that were taking place between March and August of last year, not to mention the internal factors that were taking place in certain organizations, depending on which sector they inhabited. I was really just enlightened and happy to find that both chief diversity officers and chief communication officers expressed some level of optimism around the future of the role, their connection with each other, and DEI in general, regardless of what was taking place. But we can't talk about the optimism without discussing the challenges. So some of the challenges that definitely were discussed were DEI fatigue, which looks like being overworked, overwhelmed, and underfunded. Another challenge was professional development and what that looked like, particularly for chief diversity officers, as well as succession planning. For a lot of the CDOs, it was non-existent. They did not know what the future would look like if something happened to them or if they chose to move on. And it's important to note that for chief diversity officers or those that inhabit this role, the average tenure is only around 2 years. And so by the time you really get settled in an organization, You may be leaving the organization to maybe transition to a communications role or some other role, or stepping into a larger organization to do more of the remit of DEI at a different place. So, Mac, I want to start with you on this one. Talk to us about optimism and talk to us a little bit about challenges that maybe you've seen or experienced, and what advice would you share around remaining optimistic in an ever-changing landscape around this particular topic?
Specifically, are you saying within the CDIO role, Anita?
Well, DEI in general, how it's positioned in the world, which can the external factors that can definitely is causing challenges for some of the CDOs that I talk to, as well as, of course, we won't necessarily know the internal factors, but we can all guess some of those that take place within an organization. There, some can be pretty standard. So,
Yeah. So Lucas asked a really good question that's probably in relationship to this, and this is kind of the evolution. The opportunity is that I think many of us understand very clearly that equity is not, and in the right sense, how we defined it previously is really not where we need to go. Equitable outcomes, ensuring that we're meeting people where they are, is really where is an organization focusing. Not everyone starts at the same place. Not everyone starts with the same opportunities, the same background, the same gaps, skills. And so equity in and of itself is about meeting people where they are and giving them the skills that will help them to achieve what anyone else can achieve, regardless of what their background is. What I'm seeing is a lot of corporations and a lot of companies are actually committing to solutions and partnering or collaborating with nonprofits in the marketplace that help to make that become a reality. I would say skills-based hiring is a really important effort for many organizations. Education workforce development is one of our key areas, and we focus on apprenticeships and skills-based hiring as well for those that are in socioeconomic areas that may not have the same opportunities as others. So there's lots of opportunities because companies see that they need to influence more than what's in their four walls. They need to influence more what's in society and their communities. It builds a stronger relationship with the community, builds a stronger brand. It builds a future pipeline of talent that we wouldn't have access to, or that others wouldn't have access to as well. So I think a lot is changing, and the optimism I have is the way that organizations are becoming part of ecosystems of nonprofits and government to provide some solutions to these major complex societal issues that we haven't really tapped as much as we should have in the past. The challenges still are internally, unless you're thinking about equity in terms of how you build it into the operational structure of the organization, the bolt-ons aren't really going to suffice for an equitable opportunity, like the programs and initiatives specifically. They're helpful for sure, but in order to sustain the progress any organization needs to sustain, it has to be a part of the organizational fabric and the way it operates.
Awesome. Thank you, Mac. Emily, what would you add?
I agree with Mac. I have been in this seat for 3.5 years, and then I was the first CDIO at one of Omnicom's companies called Fleischman Hillard. And then prior to that, I was a senior partner and partner in our corporate and financial practices, driving our company's diversity and inclusion strategy. And so I have, for my entire career, felt and still feel that diversity, equity, inclusion always has a place, is always important, as long as we all as people are different and want our differences to be acknowledged and understood and respected. I feel now more than ever, we no longer have the luxury of having people check their identity or their belief system at the door and then come to work and get on Teams or Zoom or get on the elevator or back in the office and separate it. That's just COVID-19 changed. It created more flatness and transparency in who we are and how we show up. And there are people who don't want to cloak their selves anymore. They want to belong, whether that is their gender expression, their race, their ethnicity, their faith practice. It does permeate into our work. Whether people agree that it should or not, we're here. This is where we are. We are in 2024. We are full stop here. So I don't think there is a world in which we can be negative on the future of DE&I, because I believe that there is a full generation who will know nothing more than equity, inclusion, and diversity. This is the future. It's the present. Now, all of that said, under-resourced, overworked, not having the right strategic positioning to do this role effectively is real. I see it and hear it from my peers all the time. It is daunting to now also be hurled into what is becoming a harmful rhetoric for people saying that DEI means didn't earn it, for people saying that diversity, equity, and inclusion is nothing more than a racist construct to harm people who are not people of color and people who don't come from underrepresented backgrounds. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is becoming a scapegoat and a dog whistle for a lot of people's racist ideals, and it is dangerous. And I think that we as companies especially need to do a better job of being clear on the message on what diversity, equity, inclusion is and what it is not. And I see a couple of questions in this Q&A from Kevin. Did your research participants indicate that they feel it is their company's responsibility to create a racially harmonious society? Do they see DEI different than racial justice initiatives? I cannot speak for all the participants, and Anitra, maybe you can speak to this more, but I don't believe anyone said that they think it's their company's responsibility to create a racially harmonious society. That is a very hard thing to do. And I don't know that we'll ever do it in the world as long as I'm alive or you're alive, Kevin. I don't think. What I do think is that companies like Deloitte and companies like Omnicom know it is our responsibility to position an approach that centers equitable outcomes for our employees, and that's employees of every background. We want people to be successful in our business, but we also want some of what we do in our business to impact a positive society. I think racially harmonious society is lofty because I think there's too much dissension for us to try to get racially harmonious. And frankly, if you start looking at race outside of America, it doesn't really exist as a construct that we have created. Ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic, those are more aligned. I also think that we in America have a very narrow view of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because when you leave America, immediately you start talking about factors like age, income, class, you start talking about language, religion, and that's really how people define more equity and inclusion categories. In America, we simply default to black and white, and it's a really unfortunate thing that we do, because then the conversation is racially texturized and it becomes very contentious very quickly. So yes, I would say we see it differently than racial and social justice initiatives. Not always. I would say social justice initiative. I take racial justice because racial justice and social justice are different. I think that companies have to look at what their business does and the communities their businesses serve and think about ways that diversity and inclusion shows up. That's everything from supply chain to who you are hiring to do your business, to how you are serving the community, whether it's through sustainable food packaging. It's a lot of things. And I think diversity and inclusion's evolution to equitable outcomes and its evolution beyond race and black and white is going to allow us to really impact society in a bigger way. Will it be harmonious? No, likely not. But will it create more respect, more understanding, more validity, and less weaponizing of people's identity against one another so that we can move and have some progress? Yeah, I started this conversation by saying It was just in the 1960s that women and people of color got equal rights in the workforce in America. That was not a very long time ago. Some of you might know people in 1960 or 70, or you might be from 1960 or 70. So I think that we have to remember that as far as we've come, we have a long way to go. And I believe if we continue the work and we continue to invest in diversity, equity, inclusion, we will start to see a more fruitful outcome, something that we can have more faith and belief in that's working for more people. And I hope that we continue to stay vested in the work, because I think the best is yet to come, and we're just getting started.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both for that answer. And Kevin, to answer your question, no, none of the study participants mentioned or even hinted at they felt that their organizations had a remit for them to create a more racially harmonious society, or even a more harmonious society. By and large, each of the study participants talked about understanding what the definition of diversity, equity, inclusion was for their organization, and building strategic plans and putting programs and the work around that to support what that definition was. As you dig deep into this report, one of the things that you'll find is most of the organizations that do report out, meaning external reports about their progress around diversity, equity, inclusion, have seen more progress around actually gender parity than they have any racial or any other sorts of diversity, equity, inclusion programs or goals. So that's what I would say to you there. Next, we will move into the relationship with the Chief Communications Officer. This part of the study was just so interesting to me because there were lots of great information. If you could have seen some of the study participants and how their body language changed when they talked about their colleague in the opposite role. So by and large, the relationship is solid. They used such great language to describe the other. But with that, there were also challenges and frictions and tensions that existed a little bit as well. And one of those that came out of the CCO side was feeling like CDOs want something communicated so many times and so often about diversity or different initiatives and successes or challenges that one of the big suggestions or big takeaways from that section for me was the suggestion to actually do an audit on communications and to see what is actually landing, what is being opened, what is being read and consumed, and align the strategy going forward around that. But with that being said, overall, the relationship is solid, and both feel like the other is an ally for them, a sounding board and a safe place. So I would like to get both of you to talk to this about your own experiences, what you see, what you suggest as communicators in diversity. What would you say to a colleague that may be at a different organization that might have some challenges with their colleague in communications around what they want communicated? Should they be involved in crisis comms, particularly externally, if something happens in the world? What happens there? Anything that either of you would care to share about your relationship with your colleague?
And I can take this one first, Emily. When I led communications in the US, I would say that there probably wasn't a single communications that we were engaged with that I wasn't engaged with the chief DEI officer in reviews and discussions. Every single piece of communications influences culture within a workplace. And as part of that, you spend a lot of time with your chief talent and DEI officers in order to kind of understand what the sentiments may be. They understand what feedback's coming back in an organization. When you're an organization as large as mine, you've got people on every single perspective, varying degrees of understanding, varying degrees of beliefs, and our responsibility is not to ever find a side to land on. It's to create an atmosphere where people feel heard, that they feel that they can voice their concerns, that they can voice their perspectives, but do so in a very respectful way so that it doesn't impede upon someone else's opportunities to be heard, to be seen. And so creating communications and addressing issues that may come up, it is, you're inextricably linked to the chief DEI officer in the ways that you are building culture every single day within the organization. So I report right now to the purpose and DEI officer, but I've never not been connected on a daily basis with the DEI officer throughout, the last dozen years or so. I think it's so important that that officer not just be involved in leading the strategy around equitable programs in the organization, but to be highly engaged within the strategy more holistically, to be taking assessments of talent and how they feel about the organization, where they don't feel heard, where they need more opportunities. And we've had that for quite a while at our organization. And we make shifts, of course, based on the feedback for our people.
Emily, what would you like to add?
That Max organization is a dream. And I'm lucky to have had them as a client for a very long time, because that level of, and him as a client for a long while, that level of alignment, commitment, and relationship does not happen without intention, and does not happen without some strategic decisions made, with people fostering and watering a relationship. So we're talking about relationships. I know we're talking about chief communications officers and chief diversity officers, but right now I'm focusing a lot on my relationships with our chief legal officers and our corporate counsels across our companies, because this environment has become quite litigious when it comes to DE&I. I saw somebody ask about the Supreme Court decisions that are happening all across the country right now, in America, that is. And I've said to all of our chief diversity officers at our company, and our general counsels in our last session last October, and we're going to meet next week. The time to build a relationship is not during a crisis or a lawsuit or a class action suit. You want to know the people who are in your cadre. You want to know their skills. You want to know the things that you all are aligned on. You want to know what they do. And I think having a true relationship requires an understanding and respect of the roles, the priorities, the things that they are trying to mission forward. So I have a great relationship with our chief communications officer and our communications team at Omnicom. She is an advocate and a partner of mine, and we put our heads together a lot, not only because I'm a communicator, but because I believe the health of DE&I and the success of it is hinging on how we communicate about it to our stakeholders, our most important stakeholder, which is our employees. And internal communications is essential. Client communications is essential. And I want to say something about the question in the chat about Sandra, what changes could be made to teaching PR to undergrad and graduate students to support CDOs. I have seen, I'm an adjunct professor as well at the University of Oklahoma, and I have seen more curricula adds to a communicator's skill set that includes diversity, equity, inclusion in the past 3 years than ever. This has become a part of the standard to graduate in a master's program and an undergraduate program. Understanding of culture, cross-cultural communications, which is what I teach, equity, inclusion, like it's a lever. But also for CDIOs, if you don't see yourself as a proficient and strong communicator, you're not going to be successful in this role anymore. You have got to learn how to really write and convey your messages well. You have got to understand how to communicate in a fractured audience segment. You have got to understand how to use the right language to convey the message to a skeptical audience, to people who are wondering if we're divesting, and to people who might say, well, DE&I isn't for me. So communications and communicators and CDIOs are so mission critical, and to aspire to be how Deloitte is positioning its relationships, I think, is the standard, but I think there are ways to work at it. If you don't have touch bases right now with your communications and CDIO teams, schedule them. Meet regularly, talk about the issues of the day, ensure that you all are reading and taking in what's being written about your company and your commitments, and keep a pulse on the internal appetite and temperature of how people are receiving what you're saying. And because I think that's how you modify and adjust your communication strategy.
Emily,
Thank
one
you.
thing that I would add to Sandra to answer Sandra's question here would be crisis comms is no longer a separate form of public relations.
Amen.
It is inherent in all of our jobs. Societal divides are going to continue to broaden. Issues are going to continue to be divisive. And so what I would say is some of the changes that need to be considered within the undergraduate and graduate students' curriculum would be just the embedding of understanding how to navigate those really, really tough issues in ways that advances DEI and equity for our communities and within the workplace, being incredibly conscious of the divide that exists.
Thank you both for those answers. I would definitely add one of the more impressive things about conducting this study is from both sides, both underlined the cadence of communication with each other. Most have some sort of formal cadence to meet and build upon the relationship. And so it makes those crucial conversations a little bit easier to navigate. But most of them were informal. They would make sure that they had time to chat offline about something outside of a formal meeting. And I think that that helps to build, to your point, to underscore your point, Emily and Mac, about get to know your people and understand what their skill sets are, because you're going to need to rely on those at some point. So at this point, I want to make sure that we're answering all the questions in the chat. If you have a question, please feel free to place it there. And I think we have answered many of them, but I see that Carrie asked, did anyone look at more broadly from anti-oppression lens? Did anyone build from a psychologically safety base? So, Carrie, there was in one of the interviews a chief communications officer that talked about psychological safety in the answer that they provided. And it was more around how the chief diversity officer, or the person that inhabited that role at their organization, was their partner in creating a psychologically safe space for them. So it tied into more or less the relationship that they had with each other, and the cadence and being comfortable to go to them and ask for support, because sometimes this work can be not very clear for some people and uncomfortable, to an uncomfortable space to have to ask for help. If you're getting ready to send something out into the world as a chief communications officer, and you're not necessarily sure if the images are matching what the message is trying to say or convey. And to the point of, even, we're talking a lot about gender, race, and identity, but for some people, it's even disability they were concerned about that as well. So thank you for asking that question. And let's see, am I missing anything, Brittany?
There was one question Michelle had in the chat. What advice can you give to those of us who are both comms lead and the unofficial EI co-lead? You may have already touched on it, but if there's any elaboration to that question.
What a dream role that is, right?
Hey, yeah.
It's such an incredible opportunity to influence the organization that you're a part of, and to lead with a clear understanding of how important communications is in the process of building a culture around an inclusive behaviors. And so what advice would I give you is lead on both strengths. Bring comms to the table in a way that's a part of the strategy that you're co-leading, and the organization is a key part of the strategy that you're co-leading. I'm probably a little biased as it relates to this, but I do think our roles are probably one of the more influential roles in an organization in changing culture. Emily, you have anything to
Max
add?
said it spot on. I think you have a dream role. It is not very often that you see that combination. I hope we start to see a little bit more because I think that you can be a catalyst for change in a way that many organizations aren't set up for. And you have a powerful opportunity to advance the narrative and advance the action. And mostly to make sure that you all are doing what you're talking about, and that you're mirroring that work. I think that's very important. Sandra, you asked about inclusive language. Society's evolutions require us to really be clear on what we're saying to whom and how. When you talk about everything from sexual identity to gender fluidity to the disability community, language has shifted. And to be an effective communicator, I think that we have to understand what inclusive language looks like, and how we bring people in and not take people out. Even Mac talking about the difference in equitable outcomes, like that's a purposeful shift. And so those are the things I mean by inclusive language. And I think that communicators, especially the future communicators, should be given some education on that. And we've created so many inclusive language guides for clients. Culturally inclusive language guides differ from America to Asia and differ from Australia to Africa. And that is going to be an important skill. I don't know if Mac, you have anything to add about inclusive language, but that's just my point of view.
No, Emily, I thought that was spot on. I just think it's one, as we think about how allies and broader representations of, it's a fine line of creating an atmosphere where everyone feels that they're able to share their specific point of view and ensuring that everyone feels a part of that conversation.
Well, thank you both, Mac, Emily. Thank you all for being here. We're at the top of the hour. We just encourage you to continue these conversations in your circles. So at your employer, if you can, please continue these conversations. Download the report and use it as a guide to maybe introduce some tough, some crucial conversations that need to be had, but also some different ideas around cohesion and bringing things together. So Emily, Mac, thank you again for being here. Brittany, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily and Mac and Anitra. And thank you all for attending and your questions and being so engaged. I will share all of the resources discussed today in the recording within 48 hours on our website and YouTube channel. Our next webinar is a special report from the Edelman Trust Barometer with a focus on some of the top 10 Asia findings that's geared toward our international audience. So stay tuned for that. Register. It's on May 13th, 9 p.m. Eastern, but that's 9 a.m. May 14th, Hong Kong and Singapore. So thank you all for joining us. And just as always, let us know if you have any questions. See you next time.